This week's double chapter of Yu-Gi-Oh! Is one that, like several past chapters that you guys may recall, is one that would be one of my favorites if it were explored better. Or I guess you could say gone into more depth about. This story is called The Evil Dragon Cards, and it involves one of Yugi's classmates, a kid called Emily, showing up at his grandpa's game shop with an ancient Chinese game, which, much like Yugi's Millennium Puzzle and all of the other Millennium items that we've seen so far, is said to hold the power of the Shadow Games within it. But it is sealed up, magically so, and Yugi's grandfather insists that they cannot open it. He recognizes it for what it is immediately, explaining that the seals upon it keep balance between the contents of the game box, the evil dragons. He cites a bunch of examples from Chinese mysticism to justify all of this, but honestly I don't know as much about Chinese mysticism and mythology as I do Egyptian, so I can't comment on how accurate all of that was. I can't help but to assume, though, that it's at least fairly accurate, because don't most Japanese people understand Chinese mysticism and philosophy fairly well, or is that just a stereotype? It's probably just a stereotype. Point is, these evil dragon cards and the container that comes with them are very much a Chinese equivalent to the Millennium Puzzle in many ways. Mori's grandfather is even the one who found the game and passed it down to him, which, if you guys recall, is how Yugi got the Millennium Puzzle. His grandfather handed it down to him. And you can tell, as Yugi's grandpa is explaining all this to him, and Mori knows all of this. He knows the power that this game has, he knows its connection to the Shadow Games, and we learn later, when, while out swimming, Yugi has the Millennium Puzzle stolen by Mori from the place where he had it kept in his locker, that Mori must know the connection between the Millennium Puzzle and the Shadow Games as well. He recognizes Yugi as the guardian of the shadows, which is not an inaccurate description of the role that he's been fulfilling in the story so far, and he wants to make himself more important by stealing that role away from Yugi by defeating him and sealing his soul away in the clay jar which comes with the Evil Dragon Cards game. Like the Shadow Games of old, this is a death game. You're supposed to use it to defeat your enemy, store their soul in that jar, seal it back up, and then the dragons will consume their soul. It's a very final kind of death, and it's honestly kind of terrifying. He uses stealing the Millennium Puzzle as leverage to draw Yugi in and force him into a Shadow Game. This being a Shadow Game, once it's started, he can't stop it. And because, again, like future Yu-Gi-Oh! Villains as well, Mori understands the rules of this game better than Yugi does, Yugi having just barely been briefed on them. Mori is able to use strategies that the little Yugi can't even imagine to defeat him soundly in a single move. He takes little Yugi's soul, but thankfully Yugi is able to reach out and touch the Millennium Puzzle just as his soul is being taken. This restores his connection with the puzzle enough for the other Yugi to make way back into his body and take over. He plays against Mori again, and with a better understanding of the rules, he's able to make use of the same strategy that Mori is. But he still doesn't entirely understand the way that these dragon monsters interact with each other. They're based upon the 5 Chinese elements, and he understands the basics of how those elements are supposed to interact with each other, and so he's able to compile a partial picture of how the dragons will interact with each other on the field. Still, he does better than Yugi did. The whole goal of the game, at the start at least, before the actual battling starts, is to draw into new cards, one by discarding the equivalent cards from your hand and drawing new cards from the deck, until you have 2 sets of 3 dragon cards which match in your hand. This allows you to summon 2 dragons to battle against your opponent's dragons. Then, once on the board, the dragons can attack each other, and their different elements will affect all other dragons on the field. The other Yugi recognizes that he can make at least an educated guess as to what attributes of dragons his opponent is going for by what cards they discard, by what cards they don't need. But then there's also an element of levels here. You're also trying to assemble the highest level dragons, and the levels look like they go from 1 to 5. So someone could be discarding level 3 water dragons, for example, and so you think that they aren't going for a water dragon, but they're actually trying to build a level 4 water dragon or a level 5. And then because these are actual living creatures that you're summoning, their interactions on the board are more intuitive, they're more natural, they're more organic than they are based on any rules of the game. You may know that a fire dragon is weak to a water dragon, and a water dragon will be empowered by a metal dragon, or that a wood dragon may be empowered by a water dragon, but you don't know exactly what effects that's going to have, and the effects seem to vary based on the levels of the dragons as well. And Mori has studied this game to the point that he understands these interactions well, but then there's also such a huge chance element here. You draw 6 cards to start, and then you draw 1 card after another, 1 at a time. So I can't really envision a scenario when 9 out of 10 times this game wouldn't come down to just which dragons you're able to draw first. And even though the other Yugi was able to figure out a lot of ways that his dragons could interact with each other, and with the opponent's dragons and with the environment as well, it was mainly a mistake that Emori made that allowed him to win. Emori empowered his wood dragon with his water dragon, forgetting that that would drain the water dragon of some of his powers and basically lower him a level, making him too weak to defeat Yugi with a single hit. If he hadn't forgotten that, he might have gone with a different strategy and still won because his knowledge of the game was still so much better than Yugi's. I want to be clear, I absolutely adore the designs of the dragons in this game. This is visually one of my favorite chapters of all time out of all of Yu-Gi-Oh! Ever. But once again, we have a situation where our hero has very little control of the situation, playing a game where the rules and the powers and abilities of the creatures in the game are so poorly defined that you have absolutely no way of following the action, aside from just reading the inner dialogue of the people playing it. And that's not how games should work. That's not how game manga should work. When reading a game manga, the reader should be able to follow the game well enough that when one of the players comes to a realization about the gameplay, the reader is capable of coming to the same realization at the same time along with them. It stops being as enjoyable if the players have to tell you what's happening, if you can't figure it out for yourself. It's like a mystery novel in that way. So while these chapters are visually impressive, and Emori is certainly an interesting villain for all of his parallels to Yugi, just like the main game that I tend to compare this one to whenever I'm thinking critically about this series, that being Capsule Monster Chess, I find this game very unsatisfying in the end. Even though the other Yugi wins and he trades Emori's soul for the little Yugi's, getting it back, I find his victory here very unsatisfying because I wasn't able to experience the thrill of it along with him as thoroughly as I should have been in a game manga. Like, I get coming up with a new game so often is difficult, but Kazuki Takahashi had to have been able to do better than this. The concept of this game is so interesting that it's infuriating that we don't know more about the mechanics. But this is still a really fun game to watch at the very least. Again, it's very visually stunning, and the little Yugi may have been very immediately overwhelmed, but the other Yugi still pulls off some really neat combinations. His gamer's intuition being as sharp as ever, he's able to come up with some very neat ways that the dragons can interact with each other, ways that even Emori is surprised by. That is a lot of fun, and it makes this chapter more than worth reading. It's just that, like with so many things that I end up reviewing on this channel, I feel like it had so much more potential that could have been explored that just never will be now. And that's what ends up disappointing me about this chapter the most. First of all, there's some really good character stuff early on. Like, at the beginning, when Emori first walks into Kami Games, Yugi's first thought is that maybe he can add Emori to his friend collection. Like, seriously, if you watch Yu-Gi-Oh! The Abridged series, you'd think that it's Anzu who's all about the friendship in this franchise, but it's really the little Yugi who's all about friendship. She ends up with that attitude later on because he rubs off on her so much. I think that's pretty funny. I also like Anzu in this chapter, though her involvement is very limited. When she hears the legend of the evil dragon cards from Yugi's grandpa, she says that now she kind of wants to unseal them and play the game. And like, that's the kind of recklessness that I like to see from this character, that I like to see from characters in general. That's endearing, because you can tell she isn't actually going to do it, and she's the kind of person, she's characterized well enough that you know that she's the kind of person that if one of her friends said the same thing, she would point out to them how stupid that is. It's a very brief moment with her character that is endearing, and I liked it a lot, and honestly, I think that with the way that Anzu is written when she is a major player in the plot, more often than not, I'd prefer smaller moments like this than larger moments like what we got in the last chapter. This chapter also introduces a couple of interesting retcons. This is not only the first chapter in which the two Yugis are treated as being different souls within the same body, not just different sides of the same soul, but it is also the first time that it's implied that Yugi has to be in contact with the Millennium Puzzle for the other Yugi to come out. The other Yugi even flat out says that if Yugi hadn't reached out and touched the puzzle when he did, he would have been trapped in there forever. This blatantly contradicts what we saw back in the Shoddy chapters, where the other Yugi was able to come out and Yugi despite the fact that Yugi did not have the Millennium Puzzle with him. It's a very obvious and blatant retcon, and while we can explain it away, I'm not going to bother, but honestly, I don't mind it. It's obvious that Kazuki Takahashi's story was only still taking form as he was writing all of this. And with the direction that things start to take as soon as a couple of chapters from now, and the direction that they take later on in the series, it was necessary for him to make this retcon. So, end of the day, I don't have a problem with it. And thankfully he does at the very least make this retcon early enough that by the time the anime came along, the well-known anime, at least, and scooped up just the arcs of the story that had to do with the Duel Monsters card game. That retcon didn't take place during any of those arcs. So the anime itself ends up being more concise in terms of the lore. But this is the first chapter where the two Yugis are treated as entirely different people, and that is definitely noteworthy. As heavily implied as it has been in the past that the two Yugis are different people, in the Death Tea arc and even as far back as those old Shoddy chapters, this is really the first time that they're pretty much explicitly claimed to be different people. And so I do think that that is noteworthy. End of the day, these two chapters are a bit of a mixed bag. I think they're pretty messy, but I still enjoy them a lot, and they do contribute to the overall lore of the story. Like, for example, one of the messy things in this chapter that I think could have been cleaned up is Mori would have been a fantastic overarching villain, like a fantastic recurring villain for this series. He is such a strong parallel to Yugi that wouldn't it have just been a lot of fun to see them clash multiple times and maybe even become allies eventually? But the way that the game is set up, the way that the Evil Dragon Cards game is set up, that's impossible unless somebody else plays the game, loses, and replaces Amori's soul in that clay jar. I just don't see that happening. I mean, technically speaking, Kazuki Takahashi could have written this game to have different stakes, and Amori probably isn't so evil that he deserves to have his soul consumed by evil dragons. But at the end of the day, that's the way it is, and Amori can't really come back, and I think that's a huge shame. As per usual, though, I'd like to know, what did you think of these chapters of Yu-Gi-Oh! If you have read them, let's get a discussion going in the comment section down below, or over on my Discord, link in the description. But either way, this has been AJ22, and I will talk to you guys later.